Is this on? Yes, it works. Okay, so my lovely colleagues just informed me that pointing is my human superpower, so let's see how it works out. Yeah, I'm very good. So I'm going to try to make sure that you all get pointed at appropriately, and that we get to hear all of your questions. So just raise your hand, let us know if someone's got a question to offer up. Don't be shy. Yes.
Okay, I just have to do this. I come from a group that's concerned with safety, student safety, safety of everybody. You know, Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. With my friend Freddie, who reaches out to groups of parents, educating them about safety in the home and also the potential teen suicide by advocating for safe storage. It's called Be Smart. I'm fairly new to this, so forgive me if I stumble. But what we'd like from you is to find out who in the public school system we could actually talk to and have a conversation about getting this in front of parents. I know it's happened with some PTAs, right? But actually a person that we could approach and talk to as parents. I mean, I'm talking from the perspective of a parent. When 6 years ago, when there was a shooting in the North End, a cafe racer. My daughter was in high school. That's as close as I like it to get. People have had it much worse than that. So, thank you for listening, and welcome again to Seattle.
Well, I'll just say a couple things. First, I think your approach about PTAs is probably the best, and building principal, as much as you can get done at the building level, the better. That we do have people at Central Administration that you can visit with. I would think Peggy McAvoy would be the person right now. And also, just so you know, our school board is very much into providing advocacy around those issues. They just signed a resolution to support the initiative that's on the ballot. And so there's a lot of conversation, and I know the school board and I and people who are involved in the public education system here in Seattle Public Schools, I mean, the number one priority is everybody needs a safe place to be in. So I've heard about the needles on the playground, homeless encampments, gun safety, mental health issues, all of these things that, you know, is now, I think, a priority of the district when we're looking at safe places to be, identity safety. So it's all wrapped up in there, but there are people that you can talk to. But I also think that the best places you can start is at the school building. But if you want to talk to the central administrator, Peggy McAvoy would be the person.
Is Peggy here?
No.
And who is she?
We'll get you her email before you leave.
Thank
you.
Yeah,
absolutely. Another question.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. Just a quick question. We're here from, our daughter goes to Louisa Bourne, the STEM school down the road. And we weren't affected as much as some of the schools this year with the teacher movement that happened a couple weeks ago. And I'm wondering what you're planning on doing to try to avoid problems like that in the future. How best communities can be served by basically not having to have their kids shuffled around to different teachers and communities disrupted in that way.
So this was one of the issues I'm hearing about, like the more consistency across the district and predictability, I guess. And it's not an easy solution. I mean, enrollment planning happens based on numbers that we have. And just so, I mean, this happens every year. There are adjustments that are made at the beginning of every year once students get into schools and we can actually count the heads that are attending. And so these shifts happen not just in Seattle Public School, but in schools across the country. What was unfortunate this year is usually we were able to set aside some mitigation funds to help schools maintain their teachers. And this year we didn't have those funds because we're facing a budget resource issue that there's going to be more of those issues that are going to arise. And so this year, because we didn't have the money to keep teachers where they are, we had to take places where that were under-enrolled and move them to places that actually needed teachers because their students, there were more more students than they had planned for. And so that was the issue this year. Can we get better going forward? Yes, just know that there's tons of conversation happening around how we get better. The answers not everybody may like, because if we put more predictability into the system, that also may mean there aren't movements, or that enrollment is just going to be stuck where it is, and then you may get larger class sizes. And so know that with predictability also becomes some unpredictability about unintentional outcomes. And so it's sort of a give and take about where is it that we end up, because we can be predictable. We can end the year and say, these are the numbers that are your numbers, here's the staff that you get, and we aren't changing. And then when you get too many students, your class sizes are going to grow. That would be what predictability brings. And right now, when we're in a budget system that we have, where we don't have money to mitigate those problems, we were talking earlier about it sort of like a rubber band that's stretched tight, and you can't really, there's no movement to give. And so that would be the trade-off. It's like, we can definitely get more predictable, but it can have unintended consequences that people wouldn't be happy with going forward either. So it's taking all those things into account as we're talking about what's going to happen next year.
Hi, I'm actually, let's see, I think today I'm with Stanisville Elementary School here in West Seattle, and we are a Title I school. So you had discussed earlier about social justice, racial equity, and a lot of people feel the same way. It's been a discussion, but as far as solid action, so how are you going to address that differently then, to take that from a discussion to some action in addressing the opportunity gaps, specifically with Title I schools, and because a lot of the Title I schools involve families of color, and moving that into something more tangible?
Yeah, that's the humongous question. And I think we need to start out with having actually real conversations. We need hard conversations around all those issues about what is it that we mean. I mean, here's what I will say is, when I can walk in a school and I see programs that are segregated by color, just that's how they happen to be, there are issues with that. You know, if you can see it when you walk in a school and you see the difference between black and brown kids and white kids being able to have access or being involved in a program, then there's quite issues. So all these conversations, and as I'm learning about the district, I'll just give you one example, is field trips. You know, when you look at just field trips, that the advantage that some schools that are in wealthier communities with wealthy PTSAs and the money that they can put into a system to provide trips for their students, versus a place that doesn't have that kind of wealth to draw from, and the discrepancy and the disparity in being able to send a group of kids on 15 field trips versus one field trip in another school. So just breaking it down even by those things, about who's gaining access, how are they gaining access, where's the money coming from. And so what I am doing now is at least tracking that, because we haven't tracked it in the past, of just field trips and just simple things like that, of trying to get better at how we look at issues, what's the data behind the issues. I like to look at data to know that we're moving numbers. One thing that I will also say that's important for everybody to know is in our latest collective bargaining agreement, there's one day, and it's a start, one day set aside for teachers now for their professional development. They have to dig into the disparity of data within their own school building. And so they have to look at disproportionate data in special education, discipline, and then they have to have conversations about how they're going to fix that within their own school building. And so I think that's really powerful that the union and the district were able to decide on. That was going to be one day set aside per month for teachers to actually dig into that data and talk about it in a real way. One thing I've learned is that we have to be real about our numbers when we look at data and we see that African American boys the opportunity gap that's there and the achievement gaps that's there. We have to get real about that conversation, about what are we doing, what are the programs, who are our partners in that, and then, you know, when we talk about the budget now and the resources that are coming, you know, it's almost a welcome thing, like when you are looking at a huge budget like the district has, even though there are the issues of not being able to mitigate some movement of teachers, budget follows priorities and budget follows values. And so if we talk about the value of equity and we really, really mean it, then we have to have those hard conversations about resources as well.
Since we're on the conversation of equity, one of the difficulties I've encountered in a lot of meetings is that does the district actually have a working definition of equity? Are we talking about just racial equity? Are we talking about opportunity gaps that are related to socioeconomic status? Are we talking about equity of outcomes or equity of opportunities? And without a working definition of equity, how do you know what goals you're working towards? And how do any of us know what goals we're working towards?
Right, and that's the issue. And so a lot of conversation with the school board right now about their own training around racial equity. They want to engage in what that looks like for them. Across the district, there are these racial equity teams of teachers working together. But right now, what I'm hoping is after this listening and learning tour and all the information we're gathering from all over the place, it lays the foundation for the next strategic plan. And what I'm hoping comes shortly after that is what this definition is for the district. Because we don't currently have it. We don't have our North Star, right? About where it is that we want to go. What's the beacon of hope that we are aiming for, that we can then pull all our partners in together to help us achieve that. So I'm hoping we get there. I don't think we're there. I mean, right now I think the loose definition would be we want every child, no matter their background, their ability, their economics, to have access to a quality education through the data that we're looking at. And so that's a really loose definition, and maybe it'll stay there, but it's something that we have to have a conversation about. It's in conjunction with the board, and I know we'll be working towards that because they want to get there too.
I'm glad you brought up equity, actually, because my first question I wrote down when I walked in here before I even saw anyone was, what is to just maybe separate the difference between equity and fairness, because to me, all the equity data in the world, there's going to be some issue with interpreting this data, and how you interpret that could affect a lot of things one way or the other. And I think equity only means so much when you consider with preparedness, like where you plan to go with what you know about this equity, and not just racial equity. It's easy. Those kind of statistics are easy to find and differentiate and prove, and honestly, we all live in this community. We know that the equity data. There are other things that need to be more equitable or maybe fair. And so I don't know, I have other questions, but her bringing up this idea of equity made me feel like I needed to jump in and talk before I was ready, but that's, I think, important. Like, what are we going to do with this data when it's just collected on obvious equity, but there's more than that. Socioeconomic, special needs kids versus kids who don't have special needs. There's a lot of things out there that have to be considered.
Oh, totally, and I am totally with you, and I think that's the other issue. Is like the conversations that I've been having are around ability, so special education, it's around economics. The work that I've done previously is when we look at even poverty, there are different types of poverty. There's situational poverty, and then there's poverty that's generational. And so, the communities that we were working with, we actually had to do a lot of research around it first because we saw the data, we saw the gaps, we knew where all that was. But once you dive in and we identified a certain type of poverty, and it had 4 components. It was deep, generational, isolated, and concentrated. And when you had those 4 components of poverty anywhere in the country, you found schools that struggled. But once you had that definition, then you could put supports around it. Wraparound services, trauma-informed services, looking at historical trauma, all these things, and teaching teachers how to self-care because they were dealing with secondary trauma. So all of these issues. So for me, it's like you look at data, you figure it out, but then you put the research behind it and try to figure out what are the supports that can be put into place to support them. Then your equity comes in. As far as resources, where do those go? What does it look like? You know, for me, equity, equal isn't fair, right? Equity, I mean, it's different. It's not always equal. And the other issue I would say is that was another lesson I learned from students when I would visit with them. I visited with hundreds of students, and no matter who you're sitting with and what topic you're talking about, 3 themes always sort of seem to come out of student groups is relationships. They all need a caring adult in their corner who care about them, who support them, who challenge them. The idea of relevance of what they're learning. They want to know what they're learning makes sense to their lives. They want to know it makes sense to what they want to be and their hopes and dreams. And this idea of rules, they know like rules exist and that they need to exist, but it was the idea of fairness. They want them applied fairly, across, not equal. And they see the injustice in their systems. And so we had conversations around, even like some of their schools had 10-day attendance policies where students who were involved in everything, drama and band and athletics, could miss 30, 40 days of a class, but didn't have to fail the class in the 10-day policy because they were all school related. When students who were coming to school struggling with family life or health issues and just couldn't do it and missed 10 days or more, they would fail the class. So they see the injustice, and so it was always relationships, relevance, and rules, but rules applied fairly. And I think that, to me, taught me a lesson coming from young people about the idea of equity and what that means, and being able to have an eye towards injustices in the world, but listen to voices. It doesn't just have to be race. It doesn't just have to be economics. It can be all kinds of different things, but we just need the bigger picture, and we just need to know that rules are being applied fairly.
Other questions?
Greetings, hello. I apologize if you've answered this already, but I have a question. You mentioned equity, and you mentioned PTSA funding. Some schools raise $400,000 a year, and even some schools require a $1,000 gift to be a part of the PTSA, and yet other schools have no money in the PTSA. What ways can you address that? And that goes to my next question, which actually answer that one first.
Okay.
Sorry.
Your 3-part question. We actually don't know. We don't track that money. It is outside of our system. And so it's hard. We know those stories exist, and we know that money gets collected, and we know sort of sometimes what it pays for, but we don't know what the coffers look like, and so that makes it difficult.
And is that something one can find out? I mean, you can find out?
If we could, I would.
Okay, that goes to my next question, kind of. In relation to arts equity and access to the arts, and IBM and Forbes have always said that creativity is the #1 thing that they look for in applicants, yet young people of color, low-income students don't have access to arts. What are you doing to work with other organizations or nonprofits or for-profits that work in arts or arts education or creativity to bring in those access points to the arts? And I'm not talking about like to the museum, I mean real arts education.
And I'll just say OMG, because we actually have a really strong partnership with the city. It's called Creative Advantage. We have people here who can, Creative Advantage, who's doing great work in our schools. And that is your whole goal is to make sure that there's equitable access to the arts in schools for all students. And so that partnership is super strong. I see it evidenced in buildings, school buildings, as I'm traveling around the district. And so thank you for the work you're doing, and I hope that continues to grow. I think it's super important. I mean, when I visit with businesses who say, what are we doing, and students get that they live in a global society and they're going to be in a global economy, and it's the ideas of creativity, working in teams, grit, all those things that students need to be successful working adults, that all plays into it. So appreciate that question.
I have a follow-up to that very question because we just rolled out of the 3 to 4 year term with planning and a little bit of funding to help pay teaching artists in Creative Advantage. And we're sort of left to work with the school here to figure out how to sustain that. And so it kind of comes in these micro corridors of assistance, and then the Creative Advantage team is off on the next corridor. And so I think my question would just be, I agree it was awesome, and we rallied a bunch of teaching artists to be in front of these students, and we're continuing that work, but we're continuing that work. And so my question would be, how is SPS, able to work with arts? That partnership is awesome, but what is the sustainability plan? Because it seems like it's this pocket of support, and then it's on and off to the next pocket, and we're sort of filling in the wake of that. And I don't know all the logistics of it, but that's what it's felt like as a partner. And so I would just ask, and I know you're new on the job, but I would challenge you and ask you, so what does that sustainability plan look like? Because otherwise it's a flash in the pan and the impacts get lost.
Well, thank you for that question, and I don't know. So.
Other questions? Jennifer?
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Jennifer O'Will. I have one child at Madison and one at Elkite, just for context. And they have many issues. But the one that I will voice that nobody else has talked about yet is, this gentleman over here mentioned PTA and PTA funding. My issue around PTA is that I notice the district staff tends to conflate PTA with the entire parent body. And so they get the idea that if they talk to the PTA or ask the PTA question and get an answer, they're done. That's it. That's enough. When not all parents identify or participate in the PTA. So that's the one that I wanted to voice to you, is that
Thank you for
these two things are not equivalent. As much as PTAs do great work and sometimes do great work, that is not universal.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question about site-based management. Site-based management has sort of been gospel at Seattle Public Schools. And from a parent's perspective, what it looks like is that a principal can do pretty much anything in the building with seemingly no consequences from the district or from the board. And so I have a child at Washington, for example. So what it looks like this year at Washington is that you can eliminate foreign languages for rising 7th graders, and where every other comprehensive middle school offers foreign languages, but these kids who happen to live in a zip code that sends them to Washington Middle School, it means that they don't. And there's just no consequence to that. There's no, the combination of allowing site-based management with not allowing school choice anymore, wait lists that don't get moved, even though there's room in the building, strikes me as really, really inequitable. It means that when a principal does something that renders the education in this building fundamentally different from the education in other buildings, and parents aren't allowed to pull their kids and send them to the place that better meets their needs, then that's really unfair. Our kids at Washington are getting an education that's fundamentally different from kids at every other middle school, and there's just no consequence for that, and there's no way out. And what can we do to make sure that every school offers the same comprehensive education to every student, and that principals don't have the power to just change things with no comment from the district?
Well, I would push back that there's been not any comment. We've actually sent teams out to work with the principal there to talk about what it is it looks like, the fact.
My apology, this is just one example.
Right.
I don't particularly, it's just bigger issues with site-based management.
Right, okay, and the site-based management, and it is, so, this is a legacy from John Stanford. When he came into the district, he really believed that buildings should have their own autonomy. And that's sort of been the system that we've been in now, and now we're sort of the pendulum swinging back where people want to have more accountability from central over those buildings. When I came to Seattle, I was actually pretty surprised how autonomous buildings are. I also think, though, that that is good in a way where school building principals can have, they can design what their program looks like, working with their parents, working with their students, working with the community to make sure that it looks like what it needs to be. The problem's going to come when we are reaching these budget issues. And there's not, class sizes are going to grow. Programs are going to have to be thought about whether they continue. These are the hard conversations that we're going to have to be engaged in as we move forward. And so this is one microcosm issue of bigger conversations that are to come. And there are growing pains, and they're really difficult. But it's not just hard conversations around equity, but it's hard conversation about how do you get equity when we're in this budget crisis as well. And so there are more conversations like this coming.
Well, two follow-ups then. First, you made the assumption that the principals are making these changes in cooperation and in discussion with their communities, and that's just not true, and that's one of the biggest problems, is that the district has a terrible track record with community engagement. You need to hear that first. The second thing is that when site-based management was implemented, it was implemented along with school choice. And you can't have one without the other. If you're going to let principals change what's going on in their building, you need to let parents and students respond by opting out.
Thank you.
And make sure if your question transitions into a statement, will you just get that statement on the card so we can collect it? Are there questions on this side of the room?
Can you speak to transportation? Schools, like my daughter's school, one of the staff said there's a particular bus that's reliably an hour and a half to 2 hours late. So 3 staff members are staying late, getting paid overtime from the transportation budget. Well, that school bus finishes one run and then comes back for the other kids. And I would say predictability is a huge piece of that for me as a parent. That knowing, is the bus coming? Is it coming out? No. Should I get ready to pick up my kid? I don't know. It's a little bit like entering a bizarre, magical world, trying to figure out is the communication isn't reliable as you've spoken.
Thank you for that question. This is a very, very high priority for me because it is super frustrating to me as well. I mean, for us as a district to be telling parents and students to be in school and it's important for attendance, for us to be failing at that is really unacceptable. And so I apologize for what's happening and just so I'm super frustrated, and it is a top priority for me. And so I've been putting a lot of thought about it and hearing a lot about it. And when I look at Seattle and my new city, it is, when I think about the yellow bus service, yellow school buses make sense where I come from in Montana, in rural America, where you have to load up and travel long distances. They do not make sense in an urban setting where traffic is hard and it's a growing city and neighborhoods are changing. And so my commitment this year is we currently have a committee who's looking at our current system about how maybe if we can get more predictability. The problem is it's a bus driver shortage. I cannot fix a workforce shortage. I do not have the ability to create more bus drivers for part-time jobs, for low salary, who can't live in the city. What I can do is I can work with the innovative minds in this city. We are a city that's not just wealthy in money, but wealthy in brain power, wealthy in personality. And so my commitment is to work with those companies who have figured out transportation in cities, the Ubers, the Lyfts, work with the King County Metro, that kind of stuff. I want to work with those big thinkers about how do we do school transportation differently, because we have to fix it. So that's my commitment, is to have those conversations and try to figure out a way through it so it gets better. Because I can't accept where we currently are.
So we have time for 2 more questions. Manuela?
Hello again. Just wanted to see, I am here to speak on behalf of the ELL community in Seattle Public Schools. So what I wanted to see is if you can facilitate or help bring ELL families and ELL parents more to the decision-making processes. And a lot of times, obviously, we're ELL, we don't have the command of the language. So things like BLT trainings that can be offered in different languages, or hiring committee trainings, because as ELL families, just like everybody else, but in our case, we bring a lot of wealth and cultural richness to the table. So I think I can only imagine what we can bring to these other spaces that a lot of times are not easy to get to if you don't speak the language. So we can have this conversation with whoever is in charge. I don't know who is in charge, but if you can help us out.
You bet.
Okay, a final question, a burning question. Yes?
This goes back to the discussion around the equity and the district recognizing that, and having had recognized the focus on the African American males in the district, and the one day this year, that sort of thing. So my question is, it's not, the data and the numbers are not always the surprise, and we see that. And I feel in the years I've been in various grade levels, elementary, that we see that and we recognize it, and the district says there's the problem, but I would love to see, and is there a plan of action coming from the district in the form of expertise, training, teaching, like actual teaching strategies or moves that we can do as teachers to effect change, not just look at the numbers and say, yep, that's it, let's just, make sure we try harder.
Make a bigger chart, look at it, and post
Yeah.
it. I'm hoping so. So I've been putting a lot of thought about this, and so the work that we did around struggling schools and trying to move the needle, it was still a mixed bag. I mean, it's a complex issue of all kinds of different things. But it was where we provided a transformation leader to work with the principal. We provided instructional coaches to work with the teachers. We provided community organizers to work with parents and communities to make sure that they knew what was going on in the school. And so we had a comprehensive approach where we would buy people and help the school sort of create a system. I've been thinking a lot about, there are innovation zones in other areas of the country that you pick a middle school and find the feeder patterns and try to create a system where you provide a little more flexibility for those districts to really dig in and get some things done. And so there's a lot of thought going around that. I have experience in the past of fixing some things and not others. But know that I'm committed to that. And I think back a lot of times when I would go to schools and you see great teaching happening in some places and some places you don't. And one of the schools that we were working really closely with, I walked in and there was not great teaching. And it was pitiful, in fact. And it was 10th grade, high school, students were not learning, kids were not reading. And we would ask students, how many of you are going to college? And all of them would raise their hands, and you knew that they weren't. They were not going to be prepared. And I would ask them a question about, well, what do you think about your education? They're like, it's good. Because that's all they knew. And when I walked out of that school, I was like, I refuse as a leader to stand by and let another generation of kids fail. I refuse to do that. That we need to do all we can sitting in the seats we are to provide access and opportunity for every child. And when we have a school that's not performing that way, we need to figure out ways to help them. And so that's sort of, we're in the state education agency, and I think we can do this at Seattle Public Schools, is we were actually to be able to be nimble. We became flexible. We became responsive to different things that were going on in communities. And so I think it's possible here. It's going to be a culture shift for the district, but I think we can get there. So thank you for that question.